Well, good afternoon. Today I want to talk about the other unpublished novel. Actually, there are several, but I want to talk about another one. It's in 3 volumes that look like that. And I wrote it in the 1980s. I wrote it while I was living in my condo on Lake June in Dallas, Texas. I actually wrote the formal copy. The two typed it on and printed it on a laser printer on an AT&T 6300 computer, and it actually looked like that in those days in my upstairs bedroom. In those days, laser printers were more expensive and PCs were more expensive. There had been earlier versions of it that I had outlined on a TSR-80, excuse me, TSR-80, and printed with an oxidative printer before, and then I didn't double space it, and I wrote it, the first version, in 1986. The second version I wrote in 1987, and I sent it to a literary agent in 1988, in March of 1988, and got back a very interesting discussion of it. They didn't accept it, but they thought it was interesting, and they said a lot of interesting things in the answer they gave me back. Was about 3 or 4 page answer analyzing it. That was kind of positive, really. But the novel is called Tribunal and Rapture, and the title page looked like this. It's kind of appropriate for what this novel is about, because there's been some ambulances outside making noise, and now I hear another one coming. So maybe that's an effective sound effect for this particular subject matter. And the table of contents look like that. It was in 4 parts, and it was in 32 chapters, which are I outlined. I had to go through the manuscript and actually look at the page, look them up, and look at the page numbers, and you'll see part 1 starts with me as a sort of isolated gay man working as a computer programmer and playing chess and having a pretty good life in Dallas, Texas, and basically set in 1986. And you can kind of tell from the chapter titles that something is coming. He meets a person that seems like a hero to him, named Craig Nickerstan, and then he loses his job at the end of part 1. This is sort of like an inciting incident in a story circle. That would be step 3, I think. And he loses his job because of a security violation where someone else misused his terminal logon, and he hadn't, his Roscoe, and he hadn't protected it properly. That was a risk then, that could actually happen in the mainframe world I was in the 80s. It didn't happen, but it was something that could happen. And then this friend that he's made, named Craig Nickerstan, that's the name, is a larger-than-life person, sort of based in my mind on somebody that I met back when I was a sophomore in high school, and then moved to Florida back in the 50s. But that was kind of what I had in mind. But after he loses his job, this person has been in touch with him and calls him and invites him to come to to drive to West Virginia to this commune where the rest of the novel will take place. So part 2 is called Communion. When he gets there, he finds out that it's kind of like a military, almost like a military camp. It's a Christian camp, and it requires you to swear your allegiance to Jesus Christ and all of this. And this is, remember, this whole setting comes from the way things were in the 1980s, particularly in Texas, with evangelical churches being more common there than maybe in the East and in California, so being more particularly common there. Particularly the Southern Baptist Church downtown in Dallas was interesting. When he gets there, he sort of is, he sort of goes through a reception process and is sort of initiated or is sort of introduced to life there, and gets an orientation essentially, and then he starts finding out what the religion is about. But then this character Craig, who seems to live in another place nearby but doesn't actually live in the encampment, starts showing up. Craig sort of handles the physical fitness activities in the commune, but starts inviting him into his life. And in the meantime, he starts learning about the political and so supposedly spiritual feature of the place. That they're caught up in tribulationism and in the idea of whether, which I used to hear talked about on the radio a lot in Dallas when you'd be in your car and driving out in the country, and people would argue about whether the rapture happens before or after the tribulation, and there were all kinds of theories for both sides. But it turns out that as he's living there, the character's name is Alan Bruckner, but he's essentially based on me. Gradually finds out that they expect a conflict to happen, and indeed it does happen toward the end. But Craig he does start developing a hidden relationship with Craig that doesn't become fully explicit, just only slightly explicit in a few intimate scenes, but they don't really go very far. In the meantime, he starts finding out even more disturbing things. There's talk of a new disease, which is speculative. This is a totally fictitious disease, but it's another. I postulated that another virus could cause much slower disease than HIV did. And remember, I wrote this novel right as we were coming out of the absolute worst part of the HIV epidemic in Dallas, probably in 1985, a year after the virus was identified. And we had some very dangerous political situations where the legislature wanted to pass a very draconian extension of the sodomy law based on speculative claims about the virus, of what could happen in the future if it mutated. Now, you probably remember, in fact, just as a point of fact, that in Africa, AIDS was about evenly spread between heterosexuals. Actually, it was more a heterosexual disease, and it was thought to be because women in sub-Saharan Africa and poorer countries had more sexually transmitted diseases. In the West, it was mainly among gay men, particularly when gay men that basically formed chain letters with each other. It supposedly didn't go from women to men as easily as it went from men to other men, except that in Africa that wasn't true, because in Africa women had a lot of other complications that we don't have in the United States. So that was a very speculative idea, but a very dangerous idea. But the novel supposes that there's a disease that sort of starts in the skin and becomes a systemic disease, but that can become more transmissible to other people as gradually as the person has the disease. And there's a lot of moralizing, speculative moralizing in the novel. The paper is available at the commune, and it's kind of a strange thing. And then in chapter 28, the character me is invited to be interviewed in what we call tribunals. And in this portion, what happens is I start recounting all the things that had happened in the past, and particularly at William and Mary when I was expelled from William and Mary in 1961. I sort of recapture all of these things that led up to that in this novel as I talk to the other characters and explain how that happened, and that there was a tribunal at William and Mary in which men underwent a certain ritual that would perhaps be distracting to their sense of masculinity. I've discussed that before, but that idea comes up here again. But the tribunals also here are sort of like an oral exam. I also compare it to your master's oral exam when I was in graduate school, right before getting ready to go into the Army. I bring that whole thing. So the whole novel becomes kind of a shell for the first parts of really the film proposal that I have now. But when you read it, it's really pretty effective. It really kind of recaptures what life was like for someone like me, and it seems intriguing because you wonder what's really going to happen. And is the world really going to fall apart? And I'll give a spoiler since the novel's not published or anything. In part 4, well, in chapter 29, in chapter 28, there's a concert at the end of the tribunals where Craig Nickerson, who's also a pianist, plays a musical work that Al composed. That's me. And after that, sort of all hell breaks loose because there's something going on. There is violence in other cities in the United States. And it turns out communists have planted radioactive devices in several cities and caused severe disorder. And that's an idea that I had proposed in an earlier manuscript version of this, as early as 1981. And communists have taken over about 8 or 10 cities in the eastern part of the country, including part of New York City in the background. That's going on, and I learned about that. But then the rapture happens, and Alan Bruckner finds himself going out, being taken someplace on a spaceship, being treated somewhere else in the solar system. Then he comes back, and he is brought back to northern Arizona, to an isolated place. And the world has gone through a very, a complete revolution and everything, and many people are gone, but Christianity will recover, and Craig Nickerson gets married. There's a wedding ceremony, and then Alan Bruckner looks forward to a possible smaller ceremony with someone that was in his reach, named Tina, developed in the novel. So actually, it's this is a novel that's sort of a road trip, where somebody's invited on a road trip, which is a scheme for a lot of horror movies, and then the pivotal conflict, step 6 or so in a Harmon circle, actually is the tribunals and the confrontation with Craig himself, where something does happen to Bill's or to Alan's body finally, and then that is followed by the return, which they find out that the whole world has gone sort of back to the bay, to use the term from the Army, and the world has had a revolution, and it's going to be kind of an authoritarian world, reduced in scope, and it's going to be religious, and the angels in the Bible are really the aliens. That's another idea I've looked at. But but Alan is going to be relatively happy living near his heroes and in what is essentially an authoritarian world, but where values are very pure. It's a very shocking idea. That it makes you wonder what this character Alan wanted with being gay. He actually wanted to be affiliated with someone who was better than him, so he could feel he was better by affiliation. He wanted to identify as someone who was better than he was, more masculine than he was. So that's almost the opposite of gender identity right now, but that's what the character wanted, and he gets what he wants, but at an enormous cost. In this case, the heavy price. All of civilization falls through the tribulation, or the tribulation, and the world has become an authoritarian place, and it would be something we wouldn't want. But the character is not necessarily dissatisfied with it at the end. In a way, it gives him a sense of purity that he was looking for. So it's a kind of a shocking idea. But I actually think if you filmed it, it actually would work, except that because it's set in the 1980s, the ending can't happen now. You could write something like this in the future, set in now, or you could have a different ending where it's more personal, where the world doesn't go back, doesn't fall apart, but where the resolution that and the return step in the story is simply personal among the characters. So that would, this idea could really work. But anyway, I just wanted to present this. I may talk about it later in other videos that are coming. I just wanted to present this to you. I think I'll show the community is supposed to be in West Virginia. This is a place I visited in early May. That's near the line of the West Virginia line. That's the high country. It's about 4,300 feet above sea level, near US 250, and that's the commune would be near this area in theory. So that's kind of what I have today is this story. So I do, and indeed I do thank you for listening, and maybe the distraction from outdoors was a little bit suitable given the subject of this story. Thank you for listening.